the sake of our visitors, I'm preaching in these services from the book of Judges. You'll take your Bibles and turn with me tonight to Judges chapter 3. I'm reading the last verse in the chapter. Judges chapter 3, verse number 31. Judges chapter 3, verse number 31. We come to the third judge mentioned in the book of Judges. And after him, that is, after Ehud, was Shamgar, the son of Anath, which slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad. And he also delivered Israel. Now, he is not called a judge, but he is referred to as following Ehud's judgeship. And God used him in delivering from the forces of the Philistines. As the pastor has mentioned, I have preached on two of the judges thus far. Othniel, the unhindered judge, he had some things against him, but he just did what God enabled him to do. Unhindered, undeterred. And then last night we looked at Ehud, the unusual judge. He was not only unusual because he was left-handed. And one of the ladies reminded me last night there's several things said about judges, left-handed people besides one of the judges. You remember there were some left-handed fellas that could shoot a slingshot or a sling and hit their target, come within a hair's breadth. So that's getting pretty close. I believe we'll give them a 99 on that. At any rate, the idea is that there are more right-handed people than there are left-handed people. And that was about the only way I could score playing basketball, was fake to the right and shoot a left hook. And though I'm not left-handed. At any rate, Ehud was unusual also in that he was one-on-one with the king of Moab, Eglon. Tonight we come to Shamgar. I'm referring to him as the untrained judge. Most of us know something about being trained for a job. In years gone by, my wife worked for a bank, and she had to be trained as a teller. All of the transactions were brought before her, and she had to understand those procedures. And then she ended up in customer service a little later. What do you call that? A promo. She got into customer service, even though I don't know if that's a promotion or not, dealing with people all day long. And she had to know something about the accounts and the service that was involved. Then eventually she became a loan officer. This demanded more training. And she was enlightened on the regulations of offering loans. I had a little training myself on some jobs. I worked at a place where we made metal baskets and other metal pieces. And I ran a welder that was attached to the floor. I had to put the welding material right down the line, and then I'd pass it on. They'd run it through the fire. Eventually they'd put corners in it. Someone would trim them, and then we would sell them to the milk companies back in those days of metal cases. At any rate, I had to go through some training to learn how to run that welding machine. I had seen other forms of welders, but this one really was more of my foot and eye than anything else. but I had to go through training. Some of you had to go through some detailed training for certain positions. Shamgar was used of God against the Philistine army without any military training. He had no military equipment, and he had no assistance. He didn't have an army. It was Shamgar versus 600 Philistines. And it's a reminder to us that God used what he had. He had an ox goad that would be used for goading the oxen in the field, in the yoke, or perhaps in a cart. And that's all he had. But God used him greatly in overcoming the Philistines. I'd like to underline 2 or 3 thoughts from his situation. I would mention, beginning with the Philistines, I want to talk about the oppressive government in Shamgar's life. And then, I think it's very important, secondly, the ox goad in Shamgar's life. And then, as the Lord would help me, I would like to magnify that it was not by his might nor by his power, but it was God using him. And so I would mention, thirdly, the omnipotent God in Shamgar's life. Now, with those 3 thoughts, follow me as we look at some of the attributes around this account. By the way, I realize that one verse sometimes does not afford many thoughts, but this one affords me too many. No, I'm not going to preach an hour and a half. And all the people act in favor of that. At any rate, I do want to underline these 3 particular thoughts, beginning with the oppressive government in the life of Shamgar, the Philistines. Now, this is not the first time we meet the Philistines, and it'll not be the last time. However, as you study the scriptures from Genesis on, you learn some of the features of this warlike people, the Philistines. They were always wanting to dominate. They were always wanting to rule. Keep in mind, the children of Israel are just learning a few things about war. But these Philistines, boy, they are military geniuses. And they're always ready to battle. I'm going to mention 3 things that are taught to us from earlier texts. You don't feel obligated to turn. But I'll begin in Genesis chapter number 21. In the life of Abraham, we meet the Philistines. And the Bible says in Genesis 21 and 25, and Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had violently, get that word, violently taken away. I'll not read the verses previous, but Abimelech had talked to Abraham about there having some kind of a treaty or covenant. And Abimelech said, "We'll not bother you if you folks do not bother us." That sort of sounds like our society, doesn't it? If you Christians can put up with the way we live, we'll try to put up with y'all. However, it didn't take long to find out that Abimelech and his people were anti-Abraham and company. And when Abraham had dug a well, Abimelech's servants violently took it away, which tells me something about the violence of this people. They were out for themselves. They did not care what they had to do to be the ones in charge and to rule. The violence of the Philistines. Then secondly, a similar emphasis in chapter 26 of Genesis. We read about how they were out to hurt others. I would mention not only their violence, but their vileness. They were vile in that they oppressed others. Genesis 26 and verse number 18 gives us this account. And Isaac digged again the wells of water, which they had digged in the days of Abraham his father. For the Philistines had stopped them, that is, stopped the wells up after the death of Abraham. Now, why would they want to do that? Just to harm the lifestyle of these folks walking through the desert. And Isaac's servants digged in the valley and found there a well of springing water. And the herdmen of Gerar did strive with Isaac's herdmen, saying, the water is ours. And he called the name of the well Esek, because they strove with him. And they digged another well and strove for that also. And he called the name of it Sidna. And so he digged another well, and they didn't strive for it. Verse 22 says, and he called it Rehoboth, which means room or roominess. God has made room for Isaac and his folks. And so they were very vile, the Philistines, mean, harmful, hurtful. Then also in chapter 26, in verses 7 through 11, we read that they were after Isaac's wife. Isaac lied about his wife, you remember? They asked, is this your wife? He said, no, she is my sister. And so they said later, man, we could have been killed if we'd taken her. And she was your wife all along. But they were vain. They were full of vanity. This was flesh that they had not possessed before. So they go after Isaac's wife, at least in their desires and interests. The oppressive government of the Philistines. They were known for their violence. They were known for their vile acts, their harmful nature. They were out to hurt people. I haven't fully understood this, other than we are all children of Adam and we're fallen creatures. But there are people that get their joy out of life by seeing if they can hurt somebody. I remember seeing it in the early grades in school. There were some who acted just like their daddy and the mama, trying to hurt somebody, trying to get something on somebody. Vile. And then, of course, they were vain. They were fleshly minded. The oppressive government. I think it's necessary we see that atmosphere before we see the movement of Shamgar against them. Now, we're not told what he was doing, where he was, when these 600 Philistines apparently agitated him or were suggesting they were going to do something to him and his people. At any rate, the Bible tells us that he had an ox goad. Shamgar, again, had no training military-wise, but he had an ox goad. I want to say a few things about the ox goad. A carpenter's known for his hammer, unless you see me with a hammer. You can be sure that I have no carpenter ability. I usually hit the wrong nail when I'm working with a hammer, or I leave an imprint on the wood. You're supposed to just hit it in, not beat the wood in. And then a shepherd in the scriptures is known for his staff, that long walking stick of a crook stick. And so a farmer was known for his ox goad. He plowed with oxen. It's important, of course, to know how to handle those animals. I heard Dr. Ed Maccabee, who's now with the Lord, tell about a trip that he made to Cuba before the doors were closed to missionary endeavor and to revival type ministry. The man that he preached for, the dear preacher, was a farmer pastor. And he would go to the field with his oxen every morning. One day, Brother Ed Maccabee said, I decided to join him. I stood at the end of the field while I watched him plow. On one occasion, when he came back to where I was standing, I stopped him. And I said, Brother, I'm concerned about your plowing. It looks like you're doing a great job. But you have one big burly ox, and you have one frail-looking ox. Will you please tell me why you put that frail ox in the yoke with that strong ox? And the Cuban pastor, in his broken English, said, oh, Preacher Maccabee. He said, I know the little ox is not doing much, but I put him in there to make up the yoke. I thought of Jesus saying, my yoke is easy. I know I don't do much in the yoke, but I'm glad he made it up with the likes of me. Aren't you? Thank God for being in the yoke with Christ. Let me try to say something about the ox goad. It was about an 8-foot piece of wood, something round, and it had usually two prongs on the end of it. Those were used to goad the oxen, running it into the rear quarter in the gentle territory. And the oxen learned not to fight it. You remember Jesus said to Saul of Tarsus, why kick ye against, that you're not able to kick against the pricks? Those were the goads of the ox. It's almost as though that Jesus had pinned Saul down with the ox goad. And he said, it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Amen. Of course, it's always hard for us to rebel against God when he's dealing with us, amen, when he's goading us. Someone says, well, I wish the Lord quit picking on me. Why don't you just go ahead and submit to him? And he could remove the goad. And you could make some progress in the harvest field. I also found out that on the upper end of the goad, not only did he have the two goads on the end, but he had sort of a scraper, a metal scraper that was attached to the top of the ox goad. And when the plow clogged up with dirt or clogged, then he would turn the ox goad around and clean off that plow with that blade. Forgive me, I know I think too carnally sometimes, but I thought about Brother Shamgar killing these 600 Philistines. To me, you know what he did, don't you? He cleaned their plow. You better believe it. Yeah. And so here he is, a farmer in the field. Apparently he's at work when they come up against him. And I want to say three signal things about the ox goad. It suggests, first of all, the work with which he was accustomed. He didn't have a target at the end of the field that he was aiming his machine gun at. All he had was an ox goad. He was a farmer, and he had what he was accustomed with in the field. By the way, the Lord, you remember, David said, I cannot go with these about Saul's armor. He just used what he was accustomed to. Yeah. He used that sling and rock. And down went Goliath. The ox goad not only suggests the work with which Shamgar was acquainted, but it symbolizes the weakness with which he was acquainted. He does not look like a mighty warrior goading those oxen, does He's showing human weakness using a simple instrument while he works in the field. By the way, at our best, we are weak. We are weak. The little lad only had 5 loaves and 2 fishes. That wasn't much. But in the hands of the Lord Jesus, it became enough and more. And may I say, you may just have some weak area of abilities, and it suggests and symbolizes your weakness. At our best, we all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Away with these silly ideas. You need to look at me. I'm not a bad person at all. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We all are utter failures apart from His grace and apart from His work. The ox goad not only suggests the work with which he was accustomed and the weakness with which he was acquainted. He was just a little farmer. I know in one of my trips to Israel years ago, there were 3 of us, my pastor and myself and Harvey Smith. Harvey had been there before, and he talked us into just letting him sort of be our guide. Oh, what a mistake. Don't ever make a trip like that without somebody who knows where they are. And so we looked for mileposts or signs of biblical towns, and we would try to visit them. And I confess we did go to a lot of places that the ordinary guide does not take the tourists. However, we made this big mistake when we saw the name Bethel. And we said, man, a lot of things happened at Bethel. Let's go over there and read a few verses. So I drove right on out there to Bethel. And I was met with a guard and his backup with M16s looking me in the face. And he said, halt, halt, where'd you go? And I said, we saw the sign Bethel. We know it's a name in the Bible. We wanted to see it. He said, do you see these machine guns? Do you see our tents? This is a military installation. And by that time, I was trembling a little bit. And then I looked over in the edge of the woods, and here's a fellow laying on his belly with his gun aimed right at us. And then he took my pastor's camera. And I said, please don't take his camera. He's been taking pictures of the Holy Land. He said, Ted, take your camera. And he said, go, and don't do it again. Don't do it again. Well, we didn't. We made sure we turned at road signs, not at military signs. It was a learning experience. I promise you, while we were up on that side of Israel, there was a farmer with a single-edged plow pushing it in rocky terrain. I didn't see much hope. I didn't see much future. But apparently he did. He just balled his fist at us for taking pictures, and he just kept plowing. He just kept plowing. I say we have a weak symbol here in the field. I would mention thirdly, the ox goad not only suggests the work with which Shamgar was accustomed and the weakness with which he was acquainted, but it shows us the wills with which he was associated. Why would he have an ox goad? Because he's dealing with one of the most stubborn animals on planet Earth. The Bible uses the ox and the donkey to show us how stubborn man's will really is. And here, he's working with the stubborn ox. So he has an ox goad. Oh, that God might not have to goad us and push us. But oh, that we might be willing servants. We'll serve him with what little we may be able to do. We'll serve him obediently and willingly and not kick against the pricks and try to be in charge. So we've looked at the oppressive government in Shamgar's life and the ox goad in Shamgar's life. And I've been waiting to get to this point. We come thirdly, and I believe most importantly, to the omnipotent God in Shamgar's life. We're talking about facing 600 military men, trained military men, and all Shamgar has is an ox goad. But the Bible tells us that he slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel, that is, from Philistine oppression. I would magnify the fact that Shamgar did not have an adrenaline rush, but he had the power of God upon him. And God used him with a simple little ox goad to slay 600 Philistines. That gives some of us a little hope. God may be able to use what little we have yet as we surrender to him. And let him have his way in our lives. 3 things, simple yet profound, since I'm talking about the omnipotent God. 3 truths. First of all, it's very evident that the story is not Shamgar, the man of power. It is the God of power. Amen. Now we read where that he raised up Othniel, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he had victory over the Mesopotamians. Then we read about Ehud, how that God raised him up for that hour, and he overcame Eglon and the Moabites. And although we don't have those exact words in our text, the fact is a simple farmer doesn't kill 600 Philistines of his own strength. No, it was the mighty power of God. The mighty power of God. So I underline he was the God of power. Let me say a little more about him. He was the God of all power. Jesus said, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. All power. He's not just God. In those series of names in Isaiah 9 and verse 6, Wonderful Counselor, we have these words, the mighty God. Now, the Hebrew name for God there is El, E-L, the mighty one. So if we read it like that, he's not only called the mighty one, God, but he's called the mighty, mighty one. He's the mighty God. I used to slip over to my neighbors. My daddy wouldn't have a TV. And I'd slip over to my neighbors on Saturday. And I'd go in and out, go back home, think Dad and them didn't know I'd left. And one of the programs that I watched, of course, was Roy Rogers. Buddy. And then I would watch Sky King as he ran things from the air. And then I'd watch Here He Comes to Save the World, Mighty Mouse. Well, I'm not talking about a TV character. I'm talking about the God of eternity. Amen. And the God of all, over all. He's the God of all power. By the way, if any sinner is ever saved, it'll be because of God's saving power. Amen. It's more than a decision. It's more than a prayer. It's God at work in the hearts of men and women, boys and girls. The mighty God. He's the God of power. He's the God of all power. Let me say thirdly and lastly tonight, He's the God with all power over his power. He does not use his power recklessly, haphazardly. He uses it on purpose, purposefully. Now, there are some people in the world tonight that have power, but apparently they do not have power over their power, because it's possible that they would misuse it and abuse that power. However, God does not misuse his power. God does not abuse his power. He uses it accurately, pointedly, purposefully. He's the God who has power over all his power. Oh, I can trust him. I can trust him because he has power over his power. He's not going to make some strength or mistake of strength. He's the omnipotent God. I'm talking to you tonight about the life of Shamgar, the untrained judge. We looked at the oppressive government in his life, the Philistines. We looked at the ox goad in his hand. And we underlined and tried to magnify the mighty God who worked in his life. C.A. Coates, an old Brethren writer, said God used one unsuited for warfare who used a contemptible instrument. Now, if God could use somebody unsuited for warfare with a contemptible ox goad, you reckon he might use you and me in some capacity, in some simple way. You mothers are not just washing dishes. You've got a little mission field right there in the house with the children. My Uncle Joe was my pastor for a little while before his homegoing. And he wanted to go with me from time to time if I wasn't driving too far. One night, he went with me up Rock Creek, and I preached up there at the little church on the creek. And I preached on giving yourself totally to God, unreservedly. And this woman came forward, and she wept, and she wept, and she wept. None of us could seem to get through to her or help her. Finally, she got up weeping, and she said to the congregation, "When I was 16, the Lord called me to the mission field. I thought I would be a missionary." Then she spoke of her husband. She said, "He came by, and I fell in love." And she said, "I never have gotten out of the county. And I'm so ashamed I failed. I don't know how I could make it up to the Lord, but please pray for me. I'm an utter failure. I didn't do what God wanted me to do." Well, I tried to pray with her, and I had gotten nowhere. And I'm standing up here on the platform. My uncle is sitting back about halfway, and in his long arms and long legs, he gangly come out of that pew, and he said, "Sister, I want to help you tonight." He said, "You feel awful because you didn't go to a mission field." He said, "I counted 5 children on that beach with you." He said, "You've got a mission field in your whole own house." It not only helped her, it helped me too. Ah, brother, I want to tell you, God doesn't have to have something impressive. God doesn't have to put you in the limelight. He can use you where you are. He can use you with what you have. What do you have in your hand? What do you have available in the service of God? Oh, that you might take it up and go against the enemies of our soul in these hours. I was in a church, and I met a man. The pastor wanted me to meet him. He said, "Tom, he's one of our best men." He couldn't pronounce his words correctly. It was evident that he had not gone far in school. But the pastor said to me, with this brother sort of bending his head down in humility, he said, Brother Tom, this dear man carries the prayer load in our church. He would have not been looked upon as a great servant of the Lord. He was limited in many ways, but he'd learned to let God use him through the channel of prayer. I don't know how God would use you. I don't know what God has in mind for me down the road. I want to say if he could use Shamgar, I believe he can use you and me. Are you interested in that? That's my burden tonight. You're standing with me. Your heads are bowed. Your eyes are closed.